when I was preparing for this, I was thinking back to just a little more than 2 years ago at a Burns Night celebration in Edinburgh Castle. And the First Minister, had the honor of sitting next to the First Minister, Kate knows well, and we discussed how we could potentially channel the spirit of Adam Smith in COP26. And of course, it's Adam Smith of the Wealth of Nations who identified the invisible hand and how working through markets we can create prosperity. But also the Adam Smith of the theory of moral sentiments, who saw the dangers of divorcing economic capital from its social twin or separating profit from purpose. And really, that's been the genius of the long tradition in Scotland of ethical investing. And it's what was at the core of the success of Glasgow's COP26 by really developing that consensus for sustainability and helping to unleash the dynamism of the private sector to put value in service of values. If I go back to where we were 2 years ago, the proportion of emissions covered by country net zero targets was less than a third. It's now coming out of Glasgow almost 90%. As David, you referenced, net zero is now really becoming the organizing principle for over 5,000 of the world's largest companies. And with the right policies, those credible policies that Kate touched on, it will become the norm throughout not just the Scottish economy, but all of our economies. And our goal really was, as Kate alluded, to move out climate finance out of the niche and into the mainstream, and really build a financial system where every decision takes climate change into account. And as this, it's a sophisticated audience here, so that there were a series of reforms away from the headlines that were delivered for COP26, 24 of them that helped transform the information, tools, and markets at the heart of finance. And that meant mandatory disclosure based on the TCFD, but moving really from the voluntary towards the mandatory through the International Sustainability Standards Board, that new board that's been set up and will deliver its first disclosure standard this summer. So talking about moving from aspiration to action, that is a core example. Secondly, widespread climate stress testing. For Glasgow, the group of central banks and supervisors that conduct this grew from the original 8 a few years ago to 100 central banks and supervisors covering virtually the entire global economy. We need best practice transition plans. I will come back to that, as well as frameworks to wind down stranded assets transparently and responsibly. So we had a series of these essential changes to the plumbing of the financial system, and we twinned that, as David and Kate kindly mentioned, with the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, this alliance of alliances, which really has moved us from, again, if I go back to that Burns Night dinner 2 years ago, at that point, there was about $5 trillion of private financial assets that were committed to be managed to net zero, not just sustainability, but to net zero explicitly. And that figure is now over $130 trillion, or 40% of all global financial assets. In other words, financial firepower on the scale that's required. Now is the time to turn those commitments into implementation. And I'm going to concentrate the balance of my remarks on the 3 core work streams of GFANZ, which I think can help inform the task force priorities. They will be broader than this, but certainly I would include these near the heart. And the first is around, pardon me, implementing best practice, science-based net zero transition plans for companies and financial institutions. By COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, the first of those plans will come out for a number of banks and asset managers. And really, we need the input of leading financial institutions, including from Scotland, on what that should look like, and of governments, Kate, to then map those best practices into mandatory approaches, certainly for larger firms, but then cascading down through supply and value chains. Secondly, as I referenced a moment ago, we need comprehensive approaches to phase out or manage down stranded assets transparently, responsibly, and consistently with a just net zero transition. There's a lot of work that needs to be done as well in terms of aligning the core financial market indices and benchmarks with the transition in order to bring the power of passive capital to support that transition. And of course, the expertise in Scotland on asset management can be incredibly helpful in informing that important work. We do also have an opportunity, not least because of the success in Glasgow of finalizing Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. We have the opportunity to develop carbon offset markets that are complementary to the imperative of absolute emissions reductions. These offset markets will be particularly important in the global south and for indigenous groups, as well as developing nature-based solutions and making real some of the aspects. Kate referenced the TNFD, making real some of the aspects of nature-based solutions. Now, I think we all know that the net zero transition doesn't mean flipping a green switch. It would be fantastic if it were that simple. And it doesn't mean only investing in companies that themselves are already green. Financial institutions will have to go to where the emissions are and back those companies, including in heavy emitting sectors like steel and cement and agriculture and transportation, but backing those companies who have developed credible plans to transform their businesses for a net zero world. So the first core pillar is around this core elements of implementation net zero plans, both in the financial sector and in the real economy. The second will be briefer, but it is connecting and encouraging country net zero policies that will help unlock investment. There's a very synergistic approach between credible government policy and a financial sector that is oriented to net zero. The more credible and predictable government climate policies are, the more investors will pour money in anticipation, driving large-scale investment, faster decarbonization, more jobs, and greater growth. And to that end, in Glasgow, GFANZ released a call to action with concrete recommendations to governments for the types of deep decarbonization initiatives needed so that companies and countries can take full advantage of the progress in the financial sector. We'll continue to update those calls to action and stand ready to work with governments to flesh them out and develop them. The third pillar, and consistent with the long traditions in Scotland and the work of GEFI, is to work on mobilizing new investment into emerging and developing economies. We all know climate change is a global challenge. It won't be solved anywhere unless it's solved everywhere. We know that those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, in many cases, live in the global south. And we need enormous resources in order to fund the $1 trillion of additional annual investment needed for the net zero transition in emerging and developing economies by the middle of this decade. And that's just for the mitigation transition. Doesn't include adaptation, resilience, or loss and damage. We have a dedicated group at GFANZ working on this. We've already winnowed down from 80 existing initiatives that purport to mobilize private finance to the emerging and developing world and identify the 5 most promising to scale financial flows. We're looking and working with the G20 and COP presidencies to develop a new approach to country platforms that combine ambitious country climate plans, or NDCs, catalytic initiatives like the CFLI, GFANZ financing, and the expertise and capital of the multilateral development banks. So I should